Hi folks, I'm Spencer, and on today's episode of Cutmania we're actually doing a request. So thank you to Her School Colours for asking me to review The Wailing. The Wailing is a Korean horror thriller. It's sort of a bit between the two. Directed and written by Na Hong Jin. The plot follows a sort of small rural town in Korea where this sort of wave of sort of murders and crimes has started to happen, where all the people that are committing these sort of murders and stuff, they've gone into sort of a weird trancey, drugged out possibly state. They've got these weird sort of rashy sores all over them. They sort of act a bit like zombies, but not 100%. It's a bit strange. We follow Jong-woo, who is a sort of local police sergeant who is put on the case, although isn't having a fat lot of luck solving any of it. He's not the most competent of policemen. But he sort of gets drawn more into the case as his daughter begins to develop the sort of strange rash and becomes more sort of angry. And this leads him to a bunch of rumours about a sort of random Japanese man that's appeared in sort of on the outskirts of town. And that's as much as I'm going to tell you about the plot, because this is very much a sort of twisty-turny, lots of things being unravelled and uncovered, that sort of film. And for the most part, it's very good. It's a very long film. It's 2.5 hours. And for the most part, it doesn't feel it, because the plot is constantly giving you new things, new stuff is happening. There is a bit, I think, in the middle where it sags ever so slightly, which I think is more that the film builds this very great tone around sort of things spiralling out of control, things getting worse. And there's this little bit where that sort of slows down in the middle. But everything that happens in the bit there works out really nicely in the end. So I think it gets away with having perhaps 20 minutes where I was a bit like, but I mean, it never lost my attention. And for the most part, you know, it's a 2.5 hour film. It doesn't feel like it. It's one of those films actually that sort of doesn't feel like 2.5 hours and also feels like about a week, because it feels like you're sort of in the world. It's very immersive.
요새 자꾸 동네에서 사람 죽어나가는 거. 그놈이랑 뭔 연관이 있는 거요?
It's in part such an immersive experience because the performances across the board are exquisite. Kwak Do-won, who plays Jong-woo, is so good at making this character feel like a real human being who is so layered and relatable. The film opens with quite a few bits of comedy in amongst the really gory, horrible nastiness, and a lot of that comes from the performances. He's a cop, but he's not the best. He's late to work every day. The way he interacts with people isn't professional. There's a moment where something scary happens and he hides under a table and panics, but it all builds this very relatable. You go, this is a human being. This isn't super cop who's definitely going to save the day. And I think just as the film goes on and you see him as a father and wanting to protect his daughter, I don't know, I felt very, very connected to Jong-woo, and that's because Kwak Do-won does such a good job of just making him real. Jun Kunimura as well, as the Japanese man, that's all he's credited as, who a lot of people will recognise. If you're a Japanese cinema fan, you've seen him in something at some point. He's very good as well, in a difficult role, in that the film hinges on a lot of ambiguity and a lot of ambiguity around his character, and he does a very good job of, you're a bit creepy, but you're not ultra creepy. So, are you bad? Are you good? Are you just a random man? He balances that performance very well, and I just thought, again, it grounds the film in a reality. There's a lot of weird stuff going on, but the performances keep you in the world and feeling like everything has a consequence and everything is happening in something that you recognise as the real world, even if there are moments of heightenedness, even with the characters. I do want to say that Hwan Hee Kim as Jong-goo's daughter is probably the best performance in the entire film. She has such a difficult role that I can't go into massively because of spoilers and stuff. But I mean, it's a role that I think a lot of adults would find very difficult, and yet she does an absolutely fantastic job. And, kids in horror get a really bad rap, but she's absolutely phenomenal in this, and I'm sure she's going to go on to have a fantastic career.
양반이 오거나 생긴 일들 아니오.
여기 다 뭔 일이다냐 그래?
여기서 다 죽어붙었어.
직접 본 거야?
한번 봤지?
The film looks very, very, very nice. It's all very it's shot in widescreen. But generally shot with incredibly wide lenses. There's a lot of really glorious landscape shots. And in some ways, I think it can feel quite distancing. And, there's a lot of times that characters are very small, or you're seeing people in the corner of an entire room. But it's framed in such a way that you can have a very busy frame where there's lots happening, but your eye's always just drawn to that character. So it has this sort of distancing effect that you feel like, I can't interfere. These events are going to keep happening. They're going to keep spiralling out of control. I can't do anything about it. But without ever losing that intimacy with the characters. And this is in large part helped by, there are some fantastic locations. It's shot in a very beautiful part of Korea. There's these very lush, rural, forest scenes where the screen is just filled with these lovely green leaves and twisting branches, and it feels very gothic but very beautiful, and it never feels too harsh or too nasty. And then there are rural moments where there's just crap everywhere, and it feels like set design must have taken forever just to fill things with stuff, but it never feels too cluttered. It never feels distracting, and it creates a really nice contrast between those very green and the sort of blues and greys of this sort of ever so slightly more urban, and it just creates this really nice. It feels fresh for that entire 2.5 hours.
맞는가? 이 뭐가 이제 이거 뭐야 이거? 아따.
The film has some quite strong, gory moments, though not to a degree that this is it's only a 15, and I think the gore is used sparingly with a lot of impact. The effects are very, very good, and they just manage to hook you in enough without it ever. The tone of this film is balanced so well, and I think if the film had been too gory or too intense in its violence or anything like that, it would tip into being a bit too exploitation-y. Because the film is so weird and builds, like I said, it builds this sense of dread because the way the plot progresses, things just keep getting worse, or you think you've figured something out and then something else happens. And it's just like the effects are used to balance that out, or to give you a little moment of something, just so that you never get, you're never just listening to people talk for too long. Something will happen, or something really strange will happen, or something unexpected. And it just tonally is pitched at just the right level, because that humour that's early on disappears, but every so often there'll just be a little pinprick of it, just to sort of allow you to enjoy watching the rest of the film. It never got to a point where I was like, this is too heavy or too depressing. Because there's a lot of depressing stuff going on in it.
자네 며칠 전에 만나면 안 되는 것을 만난 적 있지?
The score for The Wailing is very good at building an atmosphere. It is more a sort of sense of ambience and helping to keep that sort of unease and sense of dread. It's never something that... There were no key points where I was like, oh, I'm really being drawn to the score. And I think that was more a conscious decision that it... Because, like I said, it's this very real world, so I think you don't want to be distracted by the score. There was only one point, and it sort of signalled that little bit where I think it wavers in the middle, where the score was quite pronounced and seemed a little bit tonally mismatched. And I think that was the only point where I really, really noticed the score, and that was the point where I think the score was a slight problem. Everywhere else, it's just this sort of dread-filled ambience that works really nicely.
그놈이 자꾸 눈에 뵈는 것은 그놈이 자꾸 찾아가고 있는 것이라.
So as you can tell, overall, I think The Wailing is very, very good. It's not perfect, and I do think that little point in the middle of the film lets it down ever so slightly, and it perhaps could have been just over 2 hours rather than 2.5 hours. But, I mean, it does so well to have a plot that keeps changing and keeps you on the edge of your seat and keeps you thinking over such a long period of time. And like I said, the characters and the performances are brilliant. It looks far better than I thought it would, to be perfectly honest. It's just a film that comes together so well and has sort of thrown a lot of elements from a lot of different films together that shouldn't really fit together very well, but does. And I think the reason that I keep saying there's that one point where it doesn't work is actually probably quite a compliment to the rest of the film, that I can pinpoint a point where I went, that's not quite so good, because it stands apart from everything else, which is brilliant. So, you know, don't take me saying that as any sort of reason not to watch it. You should definitely watch it. Just to see how masterfully done the storytelling is in general. It almost has the sense of sort of being like a novel that you go, I'll just read the next chapter, and then you've said that for the last 9 chapters, you've just kept reading. It's a sort of film like that. So yeah, watch The Wailing. It's very good. Or I think it's The Strangers in certain territories, which is a more appropriate title, but also, you know, The Strangers is also a franchise, so I can understand why they didn't want to call it that. But that's just my opinion. Please let me know down in the comments what you think of The Wailing. Thank you again to Her School Colours for asking me to review this. It was a great excuse to get round to watching this again. So yeah, let me know down in the comments what you think. Like and subscribe so you don't miss any more videos, and I shall see you next time.